Vampires. The word alone sends chills down your spine. These creatures of the night have captivated our imaginations for centuries. From ancient myths to modern movies, vampires continue to fascinate us. But what is it about these immortal beings that we find so intriguing? Is it their dark allure, their promise of eternal life, or perhaps it's the thrill of fear that they evoke? Whatever the reason, vampires hold a unique place in our collective consciousness. They are monsters, yet they are also objects of desire. They are both terrifying and seductive. Throughout history, cultures across the globe have told tales of these creatures of the night. From the bloodthirsty demons of ancient Mesopotamia to the elegant vampires of modern literature, the vampire myth has evolved over time. Yet, the core elements remain the same: a thirst for blood, an aversion to sunlight, and an uncanny ability to seduce their victims. In this exploration of the vampire legend, we will delve into the historical origins of these creatures, examine the myths and sightings that have fueled our fascination, and attempt to understand the enduring allure of vampires in our world. Join me as we journey into the shadows and uncover the truth behind the legend. The roots of the vampire myth run deep, stretching back to the dawn of civilization. Long before Bram Stoker penned Dracula, ancient cultures told tales of demonic entities that preyed upon the living. These creatures, while not always called vampires, shared striking similarities with the monsters we know today.
In ancient Mesopotamia, tales were told of the Ekimu, vengeful spirits that rose from the grave to seek revenge on the living. These creatures, much like vampires, were said to drain the life force from their victims.
Similarly, the ancient Greeks feared the Lamia, a monstrous being that preyed on children, often draining them of their blood. Ancient Rome had its share of bloodthirsty creatures as well. The Strix, a nocturnal bird-like demon, was said to feed on the blood of infants. These creatures, with their insatiable thirst for blood and association with darkness, laid the groundwork for the vampire myth as we know it. These early myths reveal a common human fear, the fear of the unknown, of that which lurks in the shadows. They reflect our anxieties about death and the afterlife, and the possibility that something sinister might await us beyond the grave. These ancient tales, passed down through generations, would eventually coalesce into the vampire legend we know today. While ancient cultures certainly laid the groundwork, it was in Eastern Europe that the vampire myth truly took shape. The dense, shadowy forests and remote, isolated villages provided the perfect backdrop for tales of the undead to flourish. Here, in the dark forests and isolated villages, the vampire became a central figure in folklore, a creature both feared and revered. The eerie atmosphere of these regions, with their misty woods and ancient crumbling structures, seemed to breathe life into the legends. The vampire was not just a monster, it was a symbol of the unknown, a representation of the fears and anxieties of the people.
Eastern European folklore is rich with tales of vampires, each region contributing its own unique twist to the myth. These stories were passed down through generations, often through oral tradition, and later documented in manuscripts and books. Known by various names such as Strigoi, Moroi, and UPR, these creatures were believed to possess supernatural powers and a thirst for human blood. These creatures were often blamed for unexplained deaths, illnesses, and misfortunes that befell villages. The fear of vampires was so ingrained in the culture that any unusual event could be attributed to their malevolent influence. Unlike the monstrous demons of ancient myths, Eastern European vampires were often described as being deceptively human in appearance, able to blend in among the living. This made them even more terrifying, as anyone could be a vampire in disguise. They could walk among the villagers, attend markets, and even participate in social gatherings without arousing suspicion.
These vampires were believed to be created in a variety of ways, each more chilling than the last. From being the seventh child of a seventh child, a birth order thought to be cursed, to dying under suspicious circumstances, such as a violent or untimely death, to being cursed by a witch, a common belief in a time when witchcraft was feared and misunderstood. Once transformed, they were said to return from the grave to torment their families and neighbors, draining them of blood and spreading disease. The idea of a loved one returning as a vampire was a source of great dread. The symptoms of vampire attacks were often linked to real medical conditions, such as anemia, which caused pale skin and weakness, further blurring the line between myth and reality.
The belief in vampires was so strong in Eastern Europe that it led to a number of superstitious practices designed to ward off these creatures. These practices were deeply rooted in the culture and varied from region to region. People would bury their dead with garlic in their mouths, believing the strong smell would repel the vampire. They would drive stakes through their hearts, a method thought to pin the vampire to its grave, or bury them face down to prevent them from rising from the grave. These measures were taken very seriously and were a testament to the fear that vampires inspired. These practices, passed down through generations, highlight the very real fear that vampires inspired. The legacy of these beliefs can still be seen today in the folklore and traditions of Eastern Europe, a testament to the enduring power of the vampire myth.
Section 4. Medieval fears, death, disease, and the rise of the vampire myth. The medieval period, with its plagues, famines, and constant warfare, provided fertile ground for the vampire myth to flourish. The constant threat of death and the harsh realities of life during these times created an atmosphere ripe for the birth and spread of dark legends. Death was a constant companion, and the fear of the unknown afterlife was palpable. People were surrounded by mortality, with cemeteries and tombstones serving as daily reminders of their own fragile existence. It was during this time that the vampire, already a prominent figure in Eastern European folklore, began to capture the imagination of the wider European continent. Stories of these bloodthirsty creatures spread from village to village, carried by travelers and traders. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, played a significant role in solidifying the vampire myth. The sheer scale of the devastation left people desperate for explanations, and the vampire provided a convenient and terrifying answer. With millions dead and little understanding of the disease, people searched for explanations for the horrors that plagued them. The lack of medical knowledge and the mysterious nature of the plague led to wild speculation and fear. The vampire, with its association with disease and death, provided a convenient scapegoat. It was easier to blame a supernatural creature than to face the terrifying reality of an invisible, unstoppable disease. Unexplained deaths, often attributed to the plague, were sometimes blamed on vampires. This belief was reinforced by the gruesome and often misunderstood signs of death and decay. The decomposition process, which was not well understood at the time, led to observations that were misinterpreted as signs of vampirism. The natural changes a body undergoes after death were seen as evidence of the supernatural. For example, the bloating of a corpse might be seen as evidence that the deceased had been feeding on blood, while blood seeping from the mouth could be mistaken for a vampire's final meal. These macabre signs fueled the fear and belief in vampires. The fear of vampires during the medieval period was not limited to superstitious peasants. Even the educated and learned were not immune to the terror that these creatures inspired. Even learned men and scholars debated the existence of these creatures. Ancient manuscripts and scholarly discussions reveal that the belief in vampires was taken seriously by many. This widespread belief in vampires speaks volumes about the terror and uncertainty that defined the medieval world. The dark atmosphere of the time, filled with fear and superstition, allowed the vampire myth to take root and flourish, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to captivate our imaginations today. Section 5. Hysteria and Hunt's vampire panics in 18th century Europe. The 18th century witnessed a surge in vampire hysteria that swept across Europe, particularly in the eastern regions. This period was marked by widespread fear and paranoia as communities grappled with unexplained deaths and mysterious illnesses. Fueled by a combination of superstition, fear, and a lack of scientific understanding, these vampire panics led to mass hysteria, exhumations, and even accusations of vampirism against recently deceased individuals. People were desperate for answers, and the vampire myth provided a convenient scapegoat for their anxieties. One of the most well-documented cases of vampire hysteria occurred in Serbia in the early 1700s. This region, with its rich folklore and traditions, became a hotbed for vampire legends. The case involved a man named Petar Blagojevich, who died and was subsequently blamed for a series of deaths in his village. His story became infamous, spreading fear and panic far beyond his small community. Villagers claimed that Blagojevich had returned from the dead to attack them, and they exhumed his body, finding it to be unusually well preserved and engorged with blood. This discovery only fueled their fears and led to more drastic measures. This case, along with others like it, sparked widespread fear and prompted authorities to take action. Communities were in turmoil, and local leaders were pressured to address the growing panic. Officials were dispatched to investigate claims of vampirism, and exhumations became increasingly common. These investigations often involved detailed reports and testimonies from villagers, adding a layer of official legitimacy to the hysteria. Suspected vampires were often subjected to gruesome practices, including staking, decapitation, and burning, in an attempt to stop them from terrorizing the living. These brutal methods were believed to be the only way to ensure that the dead would stay dead. The vampire panics of the 18th century highlight the power of fear and superstition. In a time when medical knowledge was limited and death was a constant presence, people turned to folklore to make sense of their world. In a world where death was a constant presence and scientific understanding was limited, the vampire myth provided a tangible explanation for the unexplainable. The fear of the unknown drove people to extreme measures, often with tragic consequences. The hysteria eventually subsided as scientific knowledge advanced, but the events of this era left an indelible mark on the vampire legend. The stories and fears from this time continue to influence our modern understanding of vampires, blending myth with history in a way that still captivates the imagination.